Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Graveyard Slot. I'd like to start by acknowledging, again, the traditional owners of the land. That's the Eora country and the Gadigal people, and I hope I've pronounced that correctly. And also to thank Anne-Marie again and her colleagues for doing an amazing job organising this event, which is no mean feat, and in doing so afforded me the opportunity to come back to the city, which, contrary to our facilitators' comments, I do know and love greatly. I know where I am. I'm going to talk about arguably the most marginalised and neglected aspect of the CSR agenda, and that is the people aspect of it. It seems in the CSR conferences I've been to, and I've been to a few, we seem to be far more comfortable talking about financial reporting initiatives, the environment, processes in general, rather than grappling and really getting underneath issues such as leadership behaviours, for example. But before I launch into my PowerPoint presentation and wordy definitions, given that it is the Graveyard Slot, I'd like to ask you to indulge me in a bit of a warm-up exercise, which simply involves standing up or sitting down depending on your answer to the following questions. First question, anyone who plays a musical instrument, can you stand up, please? Okay, so what musical instrument do you play?
West African drumming.
Wow, okay.
Djembe.
The djembe, to be specific. Fantastic. What about you? Can you top that?
I was guitar.
Brilliant. Ever been in a rock band?
No, it was classical.
Oh, right. Okay. Okay, thank you. And Bridget? Fantastic. Classical too? Excellent. Anyone who has children, can you stand up, please? Okay. And Mark, am I right? How many children do you have? Fantastic. Okay, and the gentleman in front? That's you, yep.
I have two.
You have two, sorry?
I have two.
You have two. What ages are they?
26 and 22.
Okay, are they on solids yet? Never mind, didn't answer that question. Anyone who's over 40, can you stand up, please? Come on, come on. We won't tell anyone. Okay, there are no questions associated with that. You can sit down. How did you get to be over 40? Oh, gotta go there. Anyone who speaks more than one language, can you stand up, please? Okay. And over here, what language do you speak? The lady in the green top? That's you? Oh, you both wearing green. I beg your pardon. You, yes. Sorry? Croatian. Fantastic. Did you learn that there or here? Or? Your mum made you do it. Good for your mum. Fantastic. And over here, what language do you speak? The guy in the grey suit? That's just boasting. Fantastic. Well, congratulations. You should feel good about that. And the lady at the back with green? In the white? Wow. Okay. Thank you very much. You can all sit down. Thank you very much. I'm impressed. Anyone tell me what the purpose of that exercise was and what possible relevance it could have to what we're doing here and this particular diversity? Okay. What did it tell you about? What did you discover doing that exercise?
There's a lot about people you can't think at face value.
Absolutely right. There are certain things you can see when you walk into this room about people that we know more or less what age we are, what gender we are, what colour we are, but there's a whole multitude of things that you can't know until you spend time to get to know people. I don't know why I thought this wasn't going to happen to me, because it happened to everyone else. Okay, but it is happening. There will be a definition coming up on our screen. Oh, my goodness. There we go. Too quick. That's it, finished. Done my presentation. This is a wordy definition. I'm sure you'll agree. And I just pick out the two things, really, this whole subject, is the visible and non-visible differences when we're talking about diversity. And this whole subject incorporates the kind of language associated with this is human rights, discrimination, and the whole diversity and inclusion range of things. Historically, if we track where we've come to, and I acknowledge that this journey, this trajectory is primarily UK focused and in some parts of the US. But if you look at 30 years ago where we've come, the focus was very much legislative driven. With diversity, we've shifted. There's still legislation. It's been expanded from not just race, sex, and disability to also include religion, sexuality, and age will be included in January in the UK and the EU. There will always be people who discriminate, so we will always need the legislation. But I don't think the legislation is the main driver for doing this anymore. We know from the inputs we had this morning, ethical investment is increasingly important. We are being scrutinised by, businesses are being scrutinised by customers. We're far more sophisticated in holding the businesses that we interact with to account. And they're the main drivers. Historically, when we saw people as groups, package them up, women, black people, etc., that's how we treat them. There's a real danger that you just looked at page 290 of your Good Manager's Handbook and then treat all women the same and then treat all black people the same. And of course, we're not all the same. If you had 3 women or 3 men stood here for that matter, we'd all have different backgrounds, different aspirations, different skills, etc. So this requires, the diversity shift requires far more sophisticated type of management, acknowledging that people are different and spending time being proactive as a manager of people, investing time the front end, getting to know your people as individuals, what motivates them, what are their talents so that you can acknowledge and value them specifically. Otherwise, the reactive mode, historical mode, the page 290 mode, meant you could bypass getting to know your individuals, which would eventually result in a fire coming out somewhere. So we have very good firefighters. What we're trying to, the emphasis in this whole agenda is being proactive as a manager. Invest the time, the front end, not the back end, because you're going to have problems if you don't know how to motivate your people. And essentially, equal opportunities in 30 years ago created a sense that it excluded a significant portion of the population, i.e. white men. And what we're saying in with this whole agenda is it doesn't exclude anyone. It's about all of us because it's about the non-visible as much as the visible. It's about your style, your personality, your quirks, your background, everything about you, not just what we can see. And they're all equally important, so nobody is excluded from this agenda. And this is the focus on why are we doing this? The business reason, but also the ethical reasons, and I think they're both inextricably linked. If we look at just the creativity and innovation, we heard people talk about that this morning. It's a fundamental strand to this because we know numerous studies have been done which tell us globally that the more diverse your team is, the more likely you are to come up with better business decisions, 69% on average. More likely to be better at problem solving and more likely to come up with a new idea to market. And in some industries that's particularly important, more than others obviously, but in the technologies industry, Intel heard about this and brought together all their clever research and development people from the different locations around the world, because they hadn't really done that, and pretty much locked them in a room and said, don't come out until you come up with a brilliant idea. And they came up with a Pentium chip. Now you can imagine the chaos in the room before they got to that brilliant business idea, because you had to manage all that complexity, different styles of communication, people speaking over each other, other people not speaking at all. So the key in all of this is not just the diversity itself, but the ability to manage complexity. Looking at the attraction and retention of talent, you're only as good as a business as the people that you manage to attract and retain. A number of studies, Deloitte & Touche, PricewaterhouseCoopers, yearly industry sponsors studies in war for talent. What is it that makes people want to go to one organisation over another organisation? And every year, no surprises, we know that work-life balance is extremely important to men as well as women. And yet, as industries and businesses, we consistently choose not to hear that, not to see it. We continue to have presenteeism, long hours cultures, and continue to disengage talented people. We're hemorrhaging talented staff. The importance of your internal employees reflecting your external customer base has been well made. But if I take, for example, a bank in the north of England, the Bradford and Bingley, some of you may be aware of it. Originally, the head office is in the north of England. When it was set up, it was a fairly homogeneous English town, city. Over the years, though, it has become hugely multicultural. But the business died, or was dying, about 10 years ago. And a very expensive management development consultant was dispatched to find out why. And as the story goes, he stood on the doorstep of this bank, looked at the people walking up and down the street, and saw multicultural Britain. Now, I should tell you that the logo of this bank was two middle-aged white men in grey suits with bowler hats. The guy looked inside the bank window, and what did he see? The bowler hat brigade, essentially. So the city itself had moved on, the customer base had moved on, but the people inside the organisation hadn't, so they were not able to engage or connect with those people. If you don't have people that look like your customers, that speak your customers' language, you cannot hope to even imagine to develop products that they'd be interested in and provide for them. And they were lessons learned the hard way. But on the good side, there are companies who learned this lesson and have actually done really quite well. B&Q, which is a hardware, a do-it-yourself store in the UK with international presence, have done a lot of work on age and disability diversity, so that they use people, their people, in advertisements. And they got fabulous coverage on the BBC News at 10 when one of their employees celebrated his 90th birthday in the store, and that was covered. You can't buy that kind of publicity. And of course, they got that kind of publicity because they weren't making it up. It wasn't a PR stunt. It was real. That guy worked there. So it actually meant something. In terms of how do you measure this? That sounds great, Tess. That's soft, fluffy, nice, feel-good stuff. But, prove it. And that's the kind of, response I get, and quite understandably, from industries that are going through, like banks, who want to measure everything. What's the ROI, etc. And organisations like Lloyds, TSB, and other banks have started to measure this, using their employee satisfaction surveys, for example, and taking a snapshot before any diversity interventions. And by diversity interventions, I don't just mean a training workshop, I mean real effort to try and change the culture of the organisation. And then afterwards, and they found increases of 71% in employee satisfaction as a result of trying to create a culture that's inclusive of everyone, irrespective of what their differences are, their styles are, etc. And then the knock-on effect to the customer was even higher. With sound bites such as, I really feel people go the extra mile in this organisation, I don't feel I'm a burden. You can't make people do that. You can't make people smile at customers. They have to first feel valued by you as an employer before they can then pass that on to customers. But the other strand to this that I think is really important is the risk and reputation aspect of it. Since we've mentioned a few books today, I've got one to contribute to the list, The Corporation by Joel Bacon. In that erudite book, Joel Bacon highlights the duplicitous nature of CSR, i.e. as a concept, it aspires to lofty ideals, which were they to be undertaken with any degree of sincerity, would in effect be illegal. He refers, of course, to the principle, which he doesn't subscribe to, that corporate decision makers should only consider the return on investment to shareholders. I don't see the two as being mutually exclusive. I.e., being socially and environmentally responsible is directly linked to your bottom line. For example, Ford is still recovering from its infamous airbrushing out of black faces in their newsletter. People aware of that? Yeah? It's a story that's used. They had an internal newsletter, a group photograph taken. They airbrushed out the black faces and replaced them with white faces. That's a real story. And it's used in all the textbooks around the world on what not to do, in HR, in marketing, you name it. So they're still recovering from that and on the back foot. General Motors, again, famous cost-benefit analysis of their customer mortality rates when they found a fault in one of their cars. Their accountants did a cost-benefit analysis and figured out it was actually cheaper to allow people to die and then pay them than recall the cars. So, and we all know that GlaxoSmithKline is facing charges in the US for using black children as guinea pigs in testing of their AIDS drugs. We know what Nestle was trying to market baby milk products in third world countries where they didn't have fresh water. The list goes on. And the public has a very long memory. The costs of this kind of misplaced practice are huge. And one of the organisations in the UK that I worked with recently, in just the 12-month period prior to my working with them, I should say, which is why I was brought in, they had incurred £2 million in race discrimination cases, payouts in employment tribunals for race discrimination, 1.8 million in sex discrimination, and 1.5 million in disability discrimination. That's just in 1 year, and that doesn't count the lawyers' fees. That's just the payouts. But I'd really like to, you can imagine when all that's going on, it hits the headlines, you can imagine what it does to the morale of the people inside the organisation. Who's going to want to go and work for that organisation? Who's going to want to stay working there? But it isn't just about the pound signs or the dollar signs. It's about what this does to people's lives. If people are stressed, being bullied, being harassed in the workplace, it impacts their whole lives and the lives of their families. And in some cases, and we know this only too well, that people take their lives. And I've gone into organisations where people have committed suicide because they've been bullied, harassed in the workplace. So I really don't want to underplay that whole aspect to it. The cost isn't just something in terms of dollars. There's a human cost which we are responsible for as employers if this is happening to people. So reckless or feckless disregard for people, the environment and communities cost companies their brands' reputations and the trust, vitally, of customers. Scandal will inevitably hit share prices. I'll go into more detail case studies in the work strands on Friday on that. Just for those of you who are doing this, are looking to approach this in a global perspective, obviously we can't go into that, but just wanted to highlight, by just taking a couple of countries, just how different this is from one country to another. I was talking there about the UK. There are things that are true across the board, I would say, in most of these countries. But there are things unique to each country. So it's important when you're working this if you're working in a multinational or a transnational, that you don't impose a head office approach. Here's our diversity policy. Go and integrate that to your local strategy. Thank you very much. Companies who impose, obviously, do that at their peril. You need to work in partnership with people on the ground. If you take Ireland, for example, and I can talk about Ireland because I'm Irish, everyone knows this isn't it isn't an issue in Ireland because, for example, there is only one religion in Ireland, and that's Catholicism. So there's no problem there. That takes care of the discussion, any discussion on religion. With regard to race, Ireland is a country that's really struggling, I would say, with belatedly becoming a multicultural country. And it's unearthing hitherto invisible prejudices, I think. And it's summed up in a story by anyone who is familiar with Father Ted, a very irreverent comedy programme that was banned in Ireland, shown in the UK. Healthy scrutinising of the Catholic priests. One of the actors who lived in the UK was talking about going back to Ireland and being quite shocked with this whole reaction to race. And the story he told was being stuck in a taxi on the way to the airport in a traffic jam. Anyone who's been to Dublin knows that it's a city. It's one large car park. The infrastructure is absolutely appalling. And the taxi driver blamed immigrants for the traffic problem. And the actor, Ardal O'Hanlon, said, well, actually, that's quite a bit of a stretch, isn't it? How do you figure that one out? He was expecting him to blame the transport minister, but no, it's immigrants, and he pointed at a black man standing on sitting at the side selling newspapers. And he said, he looked at him like he was stupid in the rearview mirror, and he said, it's obvious, everyone slows down to look at them. And yes, we can laugh, but I do think really it captures a multitude, that story. Equally, in France, there are things unique to France, there are things across the board. But sorry, just wanted to highlight it in Ireland. There is all that, but there's also things very unique to Ireland that you wouldn't necessarily know. For example, what I call postcodism. If you're from the wrong part of town, in your job applications, they look at what part of the city you're from, what part of the country you're from. And that's true, that's real. So that is a real diversity issue in Ireland. In France, a very specific issue for France is their very elite educational system. They call it the Grandes Écoles, where all their leadership population are recruited from. And the emphasis is very much on intellectual capability, as opposed to emotional ability. And multinationals who then dispatch these leaders to far-flung places come a cropper. They have real problems because their leaders don't know how to engage cross-culturally. And it really is a significant problem. But recently, the riots in France exposed really what I think is a gaping wound created by decades of assimilation approach to multiculturalism. And the disturbingly steadfast mantra that all French people are equal really just reminds me of George Orwell's Animal Farm, i.e. we're all equal, but some, the white French, are more equal than others. Inequalities in housing, education, health and employment, etc., has created an underclass of visible minorities who feel marginalised and disaffected. There are more Muslims in France, 6 million, than any other country in Europe except for Turkey. Yet there are no Muslims in the French National Assembly. Non-whites are overrepresented in prisons and drastically underrepresented in professions such as law, business and the media. In the 2 years that I lived in France, I never once saw a black or brown face reading the news, for example. There are lessons, I think, for us all internationally to be learned from the French protests. You cannot disenfranchise, marginalise and oppress people, housing them in depressing, barely habitable ghettos, giving them no hope of a life that's anything better, and not expect them to eventually crack and say, enough, I have to fight back. Scandinavia, I think there's some good stories here in Scandinavia. If we take Norway and Denmark, they have got exemplary parental leave policies, which means that both parents have to take time out to take care of their children in the formative years. And I think that sends a very strong message about the role of both parents in children's lives. And I think businesses all too often, and governments, create the wrong message by putting an emphasis on maternity leave, which kind of sidelines and marginalises the role of fathers, I think, in their children's lives. They've done that quite well. And also Norway has positive discrimination for their boardrooms with regard to gender. And that was because the Conservative minister at the time had read studies that said that those companies in Norway that had more women on their boards were the most successful economically. And that's not just true of Norway. That's actually, studies show that across the board. We know that from studies in the EU too. So he decided, okay, 30 years, we haven't managed to achieve, women still aren't represented properly on the boards. If we're serious about it, let's legislate for it. It's actually working really well there. Asia Pacific, just another taster. If we're talking here about homosexuality, race, in parts of Asia Pacific, you couldn't have these kind of open discussions about homosexuality and race. So it's important to be aware of the different regional sensitivities working this. Australia. I don't know. What is diversity in Australia? I've been here before, and obviously I have my own experiences to pool on, but I wouldn't presume to know, especially having said what I've just said. You really know by interacting, spending more time here, and I guess you guys know more than I do what diversity and inclusion means here, what your hot topics are, and I look forward to you educating me over the coffee break. just looking at some principles for success. I'm going to look at this in 3 strands: leadership, functional alignment, and individual responsibility. Apologies, you won't be able to have copies of these slides for obvious copyright reasons. There are some images that I'm showing here that won't be in your packs. And this caption is ostensibly about the physical health of boardrooms in Britain, but it echoes the inherently unhealthy state of boardrooms where there is such homogeneity. Fat cat pay hikes, where pension funds are empty, multiple boardships, and boardships being granted to people based on tenure or being part of a no boys network, which leaves very lean pickings for people from minority groups. One of the authors of the Sarbanes-Oxley report warned that all the financial reporting initiatives in the world would not prevent another Enron or WorldCom unless the tone at the top changes significantly. Unless we rid boardrooms of cosy cronyism, which produces groupthink and very poor decisions. Leadership sets the tone of the culture, of the whole organisation, and it's really, really important that there are role models at that level for a whole range of stakeholders to aspire to. This view was echoed in a UK report, the Higgs report in 2003, which said that UK PLC is significantly economically hampered by the lack of diversity in the boardrooms. With women representing 50% of society, for example, only a 4% representation at executive director level in the FTSE 100, and I believe that's dropping, and 1 CEO. Statistics with regard to race are equally astounding. Research shows the greatest reason for diversity and inclusion, this whole thing failing, is a lack of leadership, or embarking on this as a PR exercise. One sure way to alienate and infuriate your internal customers. They know, they can see the gap between your external message and your rhetoric and the PR machine, and actually what's happening on the ground, the reality for them. The functional alignment, this obviously matters across the whole board, not just human resources and marketing, procurement and finance. All of the departments are important in this, so obviously you don't have time to go into all of them. And I also should say that I plan to go into far more detail in both of these areas, the 2 separate work streams on Friday, where I go into much more detail with regard to these images and case studies. What I will say, though, is a picture tells 1,000 stories. And this picture, for me, highlights how investment in this whole area can be so easily undermined by a HR department or marketing department that isn't aligned with the message. It is a taster, as I say, for Friday. But if you look at these, if you look at the 2 pictures with the women with the yellow hats was the construction industry trying to attract talent. That's an industry which is really struggling to attract talent. The talent pool is completely dry. There's a joker in the audience. Okay. This is an industry that is really, really struggling, and they need to be attracting women. They're saying they want to attract women, and then they go and put advertisements like this, sanctioned by their HR department. And the sexy and dirty one is for a HR position. Presumably approved by someone in HR. And the weapons of mass distraction we'll go into in more detail on Friday. What I will say now, though, is that whether or not this diversity and inclusion agenda is housed in HR, and I would suggest there's no reason why it should be. It's a business issue. It should be housed in the business. But irrespective of that, human resources has a pivotal role to play, because it's human resources department that set competencies for your leadership your people? Are those competencies masculinized, or are they, do they include feminine qualities and traits too? Who gets access to training and development? Sickness and absence. Why is the rate high? Why are people stressed? Why do people have irritable bowel syndrome? Do they try and get underneath those issues? Who leaves? Why do they leave? Who gets promoted and why? And essentially, and crucially, understanding the subtle dynamics of discrimination that manifests itself in the workplace. For example, your team away days, where do they take place? Are they overnight, which may exclude people with childcare responsibilities? Does the networking take place on the golf course? Who does that exclude? All of those things are things that your HR department should be asking, irrespective of whether or not they're responsible for this. This is one of a case example, one of many that I'll be using in the marketing stream. And this is a story worth telling, I think, just briefly, because it highlights, again, the point I'm trying to make. And this is Deutsche Bank, what I call the Superman series. This is just 3 of a series of 7 images that were used in The Economist and the Financial Times generally, all with very ruthless, competitive poses, and really served to undermine some really good work that was taking place. They have Deutsche Bank have a really, really good head of global diversity, reporting into the CEO, etc. Done a great deal of work making the organisation one that women wanted to go and work for, because the banks are really struggling with that, and as are other very macho industries. They had made great headway in doing that. So this woman complained, nothing, didn't change anything. The recruitment department, hugely upset by this. They felt really proud that they had worked together with the head of diversity to create images that were inclusive and managed, were party to attracting women, were completely very, very upset by this and felt very undermined by this, complained and nothing happened. Women in the organisation complained, just women in the organisation, without any particular role or hat, just complained. Nothing was done about it. And for me, this really highlights how very masculinized environments, as depicted by these testosterone-charged images here, sometimes quiet diplomacy isn't going to work. Sometimes it's going to take consequences, and that's a real shame. But we're still operating in organisations where they need to make their own mistakes. They need to have the consequences, because there is still a psychology of, I'm getting away with it, so why not just do it? It wasn't until I used this as a case example in the Financial Times as what not to do that the CEO immediately intervened. And I understand there was a change in the head of marketing very shortly after that. My conscience is clear. Sorry, before we go on to social impact, I really want to stress the importance of individual responsibility. This isn't just about expecting our leaders, people whose role it is in HR or marketing, to do this effectively. Each and every one of us in this room has a role to play in bringing this to life. We all have an individual responsibility not to turn a blind eye when we hear people's use of language or behaviours that are inappropriate. We all have a responsibility to challenge inappropriate behaviours. We all have a responsibility to think before pressing the send button on our emails at 2 o'clock in the morning, sending it to people who work for us. What impact is that going to have on them? The individual strand to this is crucial. We're all change agents in this room, effectively. Whatever your role in society is, we all have an active role to play. The societal impact, images and language. Workplaces don't exist in a vacuum. Whatever kind of infrastructure, practices and behaviours we have in the workplace, they will impact outside of that into society. So if we get this wrong, poor practices will have a negative impact, obviously. Again, more images. These are the kind of things I come across regularly, and they're the norm, by the way. I have quite a burgeoning portfolio now. That's what I do with my weekends. I cut things out of the newspaper. On their own, these images don't necessarily, for me, create any big issues. But it's when you see them together, cumulatively, constantly, that you start to realize the impact that they have. In that their frequency and persistency portray the business arena as an inherently man's world. They tell me, as a woman who doesn't do the furrowed brow look, not to bother applying for a job. And interestingly, I followed up on these, and all these positions were filled by men, and in many of them, no women even applied. 30 years on from the Sex Discrimination Act in the UK, and I would posit that the reason we don't have more women in leadership positions is because we've simply become smarter at subverting sex discrimination legislation. It would be illegal for the headhunters and search agents looking for these leadership positions, and they were all leadership positions, for them to write on the advert, "Women need not apply." But by airbrushing women out of the picture, that's exactly the message that was communicated, albeit subliminally, but perfectly legally. And I do believe that in a lot of these instances, most of these instances, 99.9%, it isn't done intentionally. It's just that people aren't aware of the impact. The awareness isn't even there. The self-awareness isn't even there. Being bombarded by stereotypical images of men as business leaders and women as consisting solely of the sum of their body parts, be it legs, breasts, lips, etc., that impacts social aspirations and well-being. As a woman, I was brought up to believe that self-confidence was right up there with debauchery and adultery as a mortal sin. But that's maybe what they call too much information. Language, too, is extremely powerful. It's a powerful way of subliminally reinforcing the status quo. For example, the words we use every day in our business world, businessmen and chairmen, when in fact the population that we're describing includes women. We need to be cognizant, I think, of the fact that language has the capacity not just to reflect reality, i.e., the reality is most chair people are men, but it also has the power to perpetuate it, i.e., and let's keep it that way. I go into more practical details in these, as I say, on Friday, but I would just like to say all of these case examples are chronicled in an article that I wrote in Anita Roddick's International Business Journal, and I'm very happy to give everyone copies of that. Anyone just get in touch with me. The other social strand here, can everyone read? Can everyone read it? Okay. In the UK, women 30 years after the Equal Pay Act are still paid up to 40% less than their male counterparts for the same job. If we're serious about eradicating discrimination, I do believe we need to make pay audits mandatory, because it isn't happening. Nothing's changing. Otherwise, we may as well do this. Start preparing your kids now. Give them half the pocket money than their brothers. Long hours culture. In the UK, don't know about Australia, but we cannot get people to volunteer in the community. We cannot get people, parents, to come and run Scouts Club, to contribute their time to charities, to elder care. Divorce rates are rocketing, people are unhappy, obesity, I know, I've read in the papers here, is an issue here, it's a global issue. Our children are growing up obese before they even get to adulthood. Why? Because they're fed on a staple diet of fast food and processed food. Why? Because we have no time to feed them properly. As a result of that, they get attention deficit disorder, which impacts their ability to concentrate in school, which means they get excluded more often and therefore get into crime. This is a societal trend that can be tracked back to this long hours culture thing. Long hours and the whole culture around it is unravelling the fabric of our society and our communities. Constant pressure, whatever you give of your time or yourself, it's never enough. As a society, we don't value unpaid work. We don't even have time to have kids, let alone cook for them. And the other thing that I think is really significant here. If we don't have time to do these basic things and get involved in our communities, we don't have time to know about atrocities going on around the world, about a genocide in Darfur, about famine in Niger, about the earthquake in India. Who's going to have time to deal with those things? And while we as a world look away, those atrocities will rage on. And I'd just like to end with this quote. An anxiety I have coming to conferences is that there'll be lost opportunities, an opportunity squandered. We, in order to move this whole agenda forward as change agents, I really believe we have to move beyond sound bites and platitudes and using these forums as PR exercises. And each of us as change agents, a skill of a good change agent is, a couple of skills of a good change agent is being the one who asks the difficult questions, being the one to challenge, albeit obviously sensitively and inclusively, being the one to hold people to account. That's what a good change agent does. So in the spirit of that, you can start with me, ask me the difficult questions, challenge me, do it nicely. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for Tess? Thank you. I'll let you handle the questions. Okay, good. Okay.
Tess, my name's Christine Walker. One of the things that I think is an interesting development in a lot of corporates is they articulate the kind of psychology that they require within an organisation. So it may be that you get a job description, and with it comes, and you need to be, a series of things that come along with it.
Yeah.
I mean, personally, I have a major problem with that. I think it's it reduces diversity. I'd just like to know your thoughts about that kind of thing and what you think the purpose of it is.
How do you mean? Telling you that you have to employ a certain amount of women, or
no? I mean, when as an employee,
yeah,
there's actually a stipulation of desired psychological, almost sort of behaviours, not necessarily, but ways of being, ways of conducting yourself, so that you shouldn't be, well, not vexatious, but argumentative, or you shouldn't be. These sorts of things, and they're often articulated in job descriptions now.
Right.
Which I think sort of challenges diversity.
Okay, I think you're right. I think I think that echoes the principle for doing this in a global versus local way. I think it's perfectly appropriate for companies to have principles and parameters, if you like, but without then going in and being directive about them. So I think it's perfectly healthy for the organisation to say, overall, one of our key principles, which is not negotiable, is respect, that we respect each other. But then leaving people to interpret that by themselves. For example, BP did this in South America. In the US, they had some problems with sexual harassment because somebody had touched a female employee and she claimed sexual harassment. So they wrote a big program with all these bullet points that you were talking about, one of which was stipulating do not touch other employees. Now, I was working with BP in South America at the time, and it created huge furore, because in South America people do touch each other, and it's perfectly healthy, constructive, and it's fundamental to the culture. So for me, that's a lesson in the same way that as an employee, yes, tell me what the guidelines are, what the parameters are, but don't then do the bullet points. I can figure that out for myself.
Tess, Ian Dunlop.
Hi.
You've highlighted the problems of work-life balance and long hours and what have you, but increasingly in CSR reports we hear a lot about work-life balance and who's leading and who isn't. But the long-hour culture continues. So what is happening in the UK that is trying possibly to unravel all of this onto some more realistic basis?
That's an interesting one, because I think that is a really good question. And the answer is I don't think we're tackling it the right way. I think the way the government is tackling it is by focusing on women and what can we give women so that they have more time at home and so their hours aren't so long. But actually, as long as you keep the focus on women, the cycle will continue, because it's because women are taking time out of work and men are doing the extra hours that men get paid more and women get paid less and men get promoted, etc., and women don't. So the cycle continues. And I think this needs to be tackled at the leadership level. When we talked earlier about the uncomfortable subject, we're very comfortable dealing in certain parameters. But if you want to talk about work-life balance to a board of directors, that's extremely uncomfortable. You want to see people shifting in their seats then. And it's, again, we talked about paradigms this morning, about very stuck, stale paradigms. And one of those is that long hours culture is good for business. Get as much out of people as you can. Push them to the very, very limit. It's so old hat. Because what it does is push people to the limit. It either pushes them completely over the edge, or they burn out so quickly, they get out of your organisation and go somewhere else. So I think that there's a key role, in my role, if you like, is educating and influencing at the highest level in the organisation and getting them to change their behaviours, even if they're not bought into the idea that they themselves will adapt their hours of working. Being aware of the impact it has on the next level down and the next level down, making them aware of the fact that talented people won't tolerate that anymore. They will go somewhere else. So that they will think twice before phoning in from holiday, pressing the send button at 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning. Changing behaviours at that level, I think, is really important, even if they don't completely buy into it. Thank you. Hi.
Linda Fennell-Milner. I thought that was fantastic, and I have noticed all over the world, not just in Australia, that often when there is a major difference between rhetoric and behaviour inside an organisation, women are the first to walk from senior positions.
Yeah.
And that obviously is, a brain drain on the organisation, and often those organisations have worked hard to get women in those positions, but they just do not stay.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you can give us any examples of some organisations who actually may have cracked that particular issue for retaining, not just attracting, but actually retaining senior women.
Sadly, I would love to be able to tell you that I know of a company who's cracked it, but I don't. I really don't. What I can say, though, is that I know organisations are really trying. Some organisations are really trying. But again, my litmus test for that is, are these interventions we're talking about, if we're talking about culture that alienates women, and indeed men, with more feminine styles as well, because men and women, there's a mixture in both areas. Some men with feminine styles are switched off as well. But you're right, predominantly women will walk. If we're serious about that, then are we discussing the behaviours, the tone in the organisation? Are we prepared to change that? And some organisations are looking at that, but it's a really, really difficult task, because it means going to the boardroom, where there are no women usually, and saying, look, your behaviours are impacting all the way down the organisation. And this is how people feel they have to behave to get to the top. And actually women don't seem to fit that criteria, that unwritten criteria. So all this other work that we're doing is a complete waste of time, money and effort. So there is some good work going on, and I'm involved with 2 very macho-type industries at the moment who are doing phenomenal work. They really, really are, and they're even allowing me into the boardroom, which is fantastic. And that, to me, as I say, is a litmus test. So there are some good things happening. People are now prepared to have the difficult conversations, at least. Okay. Is that one over there?
It's probably the last question.
Tess, thanks for that great presentation. My name's Caroline Bayliss from Melbourne. Last week in our Financial Review newspaper, there was an article on companies and domestic violence
in Australia, and the general tenor of it was that whilst companies are providing all sorts of employee assistance counselling and things, they haven't, as a general rule, gone the next step and understood the implications of domestic violence throughout their own organisation in terms of absenteeism, productivity, morale, etc. And in fact that it is, sorry about my voice, not just a women's issue, but a men and women issue and beyond that. I'd be interested in your comments on whether you see that as actually symptomatic of organisations actually insulating or quarantining themselves from more general, what they see as more general societal issues that aren't really necessarily, as they say, their own responsibility.
Right. Are you saying that the organisations are trying to engage, are trying to encourage people to be honest about, to be open about it?
There was examples that some were, but the general tenor of the article was that companies weren't engaging on this issue at all.
Okay. I think without knowing the inside, I think it's very interesting. But I think for me, it sums up how organisations often do that. There is this stance that if it happened outside of the workplace, it's not a work issue. But my view is, if whatever is happening outside of the workplace, if people bring it into the work and there's a huge emotional and physical trauma like that, it's completely disingenuous to imagine that will not have an impact in the workplace. So whilst I don't advocate the employer becoming taking on a counsellor role for the individual, I do believe the employer should acknowledge people's, whatever the hardships they're experiencing outside, acknowledging them, giving them the kind of support that's appropriate within the context of the workplace so that they can do their job effectively. So it isn't as cut and dry in that. And that means getting involved in the messy bits. And generally employers don't like the messy bits. They want to look at page 290 where it's all black and white and nice and easy. Thank you. I think that's it. Thank you all very much.